There are plenty of arcane stat boosting relics that have been added to the Deep of Night update. Some of these relics just give you a small increase, some are tied behind clearing out ruins, and there are others that are character specific. Now, the arcane stat in general is typically going to be the weakest on average because arcane is a damaging stat like strength, dexterity, faith, and intelligence. However, there aren't many arcane scaling weapons in the game. In fact, out of all like 330 or whatever there are only 13 weapons that actually have their damage or some of their damage scale off arcane. However, arcane also does boost status effects. Now, when I say boosting status effects, it doesn't actually boost the damage at all. It's just going to improve how quickly you can build up that said status effect. So for an example, the Sword of Milos is a great sword that comes with passive bleed, but let's just say I have 10 arcane, it's just going to be doing just as much damage as if I had 30 arcane. The only difference is that it's going to proc bleed that little bit quicker. And comparing the character that has the least amount of arcane in the game with a character that has the highest amount of arcane in the game, the status effect build-up difference is only roughly 25%. So yes, the Executor is only really going to get like 25% more bleed build-up than someone like the Wilder would, which is really not going to be that noticeable when you are fighting these like lower HP targets that don't really have much resistance to status effects, and it's only really going to be noticeable if you are fighting enemies that are pretty resist to status effects or with enemies with large amounts of HP like a Knight's Lord boss. Because yeah, if you don't know, the more that you proc one status effect, the harder it's going to end up being the second, third, and fourth time. And it's only really in those circumstances where that more arcane is going to be a bit noticeable. So with that being said, all these small arcane boosting relics, like the ones that give you +3 arcane or +4 arcane for clearing out of ruins, aren't really going to be that valuable. However, the character-specific relics that do give you a boost to arcane, like for the Ironeye and the Raider, they actually receive an arcane boost to give them basically just as much arcane as the Executor. Now, first, we are going to start off with the Ironeye because, you know, he is the most popular character, but he does receive an increase to arcane to be equal with the Executor's arcane, but he does receive a decrease to dexterity, which roughly has him lose out on 7% damage with dexterity-based weapons, and that is assuming you are at level 15. If you are below level 15, it's probably going to be more than a 7% damage decrease. Now, just to get it out of the way right now, I know people like to pair this arcane-based relic with the poison-based relic, but honestly, this doesn't really have much synergy at all. Because for one, the damage that you get when you hit a poisoned enemy with the mark is going to be the same damage no matter what. Doesn't matter how much arcane or how much dexterity that you have, it's always going to be that same amount of damage, and arcane doesn't affect that at all. However, arcane is going to affect how much poison buildup the mark does itself, but once again, it's only going to really be about a 20% difference. So instead of having 70 poison buildup, you're going to have roughly 80 to 85 poison buildup. And with a lot of bosses having roughly 200 poison resist, it's going to end up taking multiple procs of this mark effect to be able to get the poison to proc anyway. So if I am building around this poison playstyle, I'd definitely much rather have a poison-based weapon in my hand, like having the Sentient Pest Relic and your bow be poison infused. And with the poison infusion, it only adds 30 poison to the weapon, so with this relic, it's gonna only end up being about 35 poison. So at best, it's gonna take like 1 or 2 hits less to proc poison, which this entire playstyle is proccing poison and then switching to your higher damaging weapons, whether it still be bows or melee weapons, and I'd much rather just have the higher raw damage than just being able to proc poison in a couple extra hits. Now, there is going to be one specific bow out there that actually does get an arcane scaling, which is the Serpent's Bow, and with this relic, that bow is actually going to be getting more damage, where compared to all the other bows, they get less damage with the relic equipped. Now, even then, it's still the same thing that applies, like it is going to be doing more damage, and it is going to be proccing poison quicker, but it's still not going to be doing as much damage as the other regular bows that don't have a status effect, because the Serpent's Bow receives a 15% damage penalty for having a status effect. Now, when it does come to melee Ironeye, which I think is like the superior way to play the character, it is going to be a little bit more useful, but it's still going to be a very similar sentiment. If you are using weapons that just come with a status effect and no arcane scaling, I'm not going to really care for it as much. Like, I did some testing with a weapon like the Hand of Millennia, and I was just spamming my weapon against the test dummy, And even though you can proc bleed more often, and even with an extra bleed proc, you're going to be doing more damage and more sustained damage if you just didn't have the relic to begin with. Now do keep in mind is that this testing was done with like a regular trash mob, and regular trash mobs don't have as much health as bosses, so the percentage bleed isn't going to really be as noticeable, but also to keep in mind that bosses do just take less percentage damage to status effects, whereas for like regular trash mobs, could be taking roughly 20% of their max health in bleed. When it comes to some boss fights in certain circumstances, they can be taking less than 10% max HP damage from bleed. But even then, it still is percentage damage, and with large HP targets, proccing bleed faster is still going to end up being better, but at best, it's only going to be a little bit better, and it's only going to be for those very specific circumstances. Because throughout the rest of the run, if you're not fighting these large HP targets, having the more raw damage is just going to be better. And especially if you are fighting enemies that are really resist to status effects, where you're only going to really proc the status once or twice anyway, or obviously if they are immune to status effects. But there is one very specific build out there that can work very well with this character, and that is going to be if you are using dormant katanas and fishing for the rivers of blood. Now, I think having dormant katanas is probably one of the most important relics to have with the Ironeye, because it is probably the best dexterity weapon type that you can get, and you can actually gain max potential of this weapon by just having it one-handed. So you actually can just have a bow just be equipped in your left hand and being able to shoot a bow while actually having a good melee weapon equipped too. Because yeah, bows can be good, but they're never going to do anywhere near as much damage as a katana would. And as I mentioned with the serpent bow, the Rivers of Blood is also going to be getting an arcane scaling, and it's actually going to be doing more damage with the relic equipped compared to if you didn't have it equipped. And not only is it going to be doing more damage, but it's also going to be doing some more bleed buildup. And the Rivers of Blood actually has a pretty decent chance of dropping every single expedition, because it is one of 3 purple katanas. So if you do end up clearing out some pretty challenging field bosses, or clearing out bosses in the middle castle, you can have a very good chance of getting the Rivers of Blood to spawn, and then having this relic is definitely going to be the best in slot. And if you somehow manage to find a serpent bow, which is going to be very rare, being that you do have the dormant katanas instead, it's just going to be fantastic, because you can just use your bow to proc the poison, and then you can use your marking skill and spam your Rivers of Blood to just destroy all the bosses in the game, obviously except for the ones that are like really resist to fire damage. So I would actually have like a separate build for this if you were to fight bosses like neutral to fire damage or weaker to it, and there's hope that you do get the Rivers of Blood. But if I am fighting bosses like Hjolstor, Gladius, maybe even Gaping Jaw, I'm probably going to be switching off this build. Now next, I want to talk about the Raider Arcane Relic, which honestly I think it's pretty good, and you should just have it equipped if you have it in combination with some other decent relic perks, like if you have physical attack up or partial HP restoration, increased maximum HP, then I will just slap it on, because you benefit a lot more than what the downsides actually have, which is only -4 vigor, which equals 80 HP. And with how much damage things are doing anyway, it's not going to be that big of a deal. It might suck in certain circumstances, especially because of the Raider doesn't have the best synergy with things like successive attacks or damage negation at full HP with how his character skill works. But the reason why I say this equip it no matter what is because it does just give him just as much arcane as the Executor. Now, the Raider being a strength-based character, inherently the weapons are going to swing slower. And even though that these slower weapons might come with just more status buildup than quicker types weapons, they're still not going to be able to proc status effects as quickly. So trying to build around it isn't going to really be like the best play. There are certain types of builds that you can make, which I will get into, but for the most part, it's just something to have for good utility, because every single run, you should just be aiming towards using status effects no matter what. Like if you find something like the Great Stars, the Geese as well, like a random Frost Hammer, or like the Rotten Great Axe, you're just always going to benefit by having this relic equipped, because you will end up proccing statuses a few hits faster than you otherwise normally would. Now, in terms of building around this relic, I don't really recommend it as much, because just like the Ironeye, it's going to be pretty niche. Now, just to get it out of the way right now, I don't think that the Starfist build is really going to be that good. And the main reason being is that the Wilder gets so much more damage with the Starfist that even if you account for the faster bleed procs with the Raider, it's actually going to end up being a lot less damage. Now, once again, this testing is done against like a regular small trash mob. The percentage damage that bleed does is obviously going to be a lot more noticeable against these larger HP types of bosses. but it's only going to be those specific circumstances where the bosses might be somewhat susceptible to a status effect like bleed, that it might end up being a little bit better. But I still would much rather play with the Starfist with someone like the Wilder and even the Duchess with a strength-based relic, because with the power of Restage, not only can you outdamage it, but also do more status build-up. But yeah, those characters are just going to do a lot better. And the fact that this relic actually decreases the Raider's health, it's actually going to put him at lower health than the Wilder. So the Wilder's going to have more health, more damage with this weapon type, as well as many other weapon types, while having a much better set of skills, like his passive, character skill, ultimate, that is all better to have than the Raider kit in this game mode. However, as I mentioned with the Ironeye, actually finding weapons that do have arcane scalings, so you can at least benefit of having a bit more damage alongside the better status buildup, is definitely what you're going to aim towards. Now, there are going to be roughly 4 strength arcane based weapons. Now, unfortunately, 2 of them are legendary in the Mariah's Executioner Sword and the Mogwin's Sacred Spear. So I wouldn't really plan around those ones, but weapons that you could potentially plan around would be the Vare's Bouquet and the Clinging Bone. Like 2 weapons that are notoriously shit in the base game are probably going to be one of the best options when it comes to a strength arcane playstyle. Now, to try and aim towards getting these, obviously we would have to run Dormant Hammers and Dormant Fists, which even if you don't end up getting the Vare's Bouquet or the Clinging Bone, you still at least have options to a bunch of other bleed weapons. Like half of the blue rarity hammers actually come with bleed in the Spite Club, Morningstar, and Vare's Bouquet. But the Vare's Bouquet is going to be the best one to use because it actually does come alongside an arcane scaling, so you can also benefit of a bit more damage. Now, the Vare's Bouquet actually gets some pretty low base damage, so even with the higher amount of arcane and its arcane scaling, it's still going to only end up being just as much damage as things like the Morningstar or the Spite Club. But the reason why the Vare's Bouquet has such low damage is because it's going to get a lot more bleed buildup due to that arcane scaling. So you can actually proc bleed a lot faster with the Vare's Bouquet while getting respectable damage and actually having a decent stance breaking option, because if you don't know, charged heavy attacks of hammers are really fast and do just as much stance damage as Colossal Sword charged heavy attacks. Now, the obvious downside there is that obviously charged heavy attacks don't swing that quickly, and to proc status effects, you kind of want to swing quickly. So a bleed-based hammer is like somewhat counterintuitive, but you're still going to end up benefiting of 2 different great playstyles. And when it comes to the fist weapons, 2 out of the 3 blue fist weapons are actually going to be bleed-based in the Spiked Kestis and the Starfist. So even though you're not going to really benefit off more damage, being that those don't have an arcane scaling with like a normal infusion, you're still going to actually benefit off that 25% faster blood loss buildup. But another weapon that you can look out for would be the Clinging Bone. And the reason being is that this one does have an arcane scaling. In fact, it actually gets a B scaling in arcane and in strength, and is going to end up out damaging every single fist weapon. The only fist weapon that could actually out damage this would be the Grafted Dragon when used with the Wilder or a Strength Revenant build. Now, the downside of the Clinging Bone is that it doesn't come alongside a status effect, which that's kind of what like half of Arcane has to offer. But in this game, there is basically no penalty to be able to equip multiple different weapons. So you can very well have multiple options for multiple status effects and then use this one for your damaging based option. Because if you don't know, fist weapons do amazing stance damage with those charged heavy attacks. Now, unfortunately for the Clinging Bone, the 2-handed charged heavy attack does terrible stance damage, but the 1-handed charged heavy attack does amazing stance damage. For some dumb reason, I don't know why it's like this in regular Elden Ring as well, but it does literally twice as much stance damage when you have it one-handed while having a much faster animation. And it feels like every single time that I find a Clinging Bone, it always comes in combination with like some insane charged heavy attack buff, and these things can just be broken. So overall, I think it's a fantastic relic to just have equipped if it comes alongside some decent stuff. But if you are trying to specifically build around it, I only really would try and bank on things like the Vare's Bouquet or the Clinging Bone, and even then, still going to be somewhat rare to be able to find those weapons, and it's also going to be very limiting as well. Now, last I want to cover is the Executor and his arcane boosting relic. Now, I'm actually going to value this one the most out of the 3, And part of the reason being is because it also comes alongside a dexterity boost. So not only is he actually going to get a damage boost, but he's also going to get the status effect boost. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do find some arcane scaling weapons, which is pretty likely with the Executor, and finding something like the Rivers of Blood, he's actually going to get a lot more damage and a lot more status buildup, roughly around about 10% status and around about 7% more damage. Now, the unfortunate part is that it is going to come alongside a pretty hefty health loss. He does actually end up losing 7 vigor, which equals roughly 140 HP. So it pretty much puts him in line with the Duchess in terms of health, which in this game mode, the health isn't going to really be as important when you're kind of going to be getting one-shots anyway, especially at those later depths. And if you end up finding a couple of damage negations at full HP, you can survive a hit either way. So that's pretty much the thought process behind that. Like, there's nothing too deep or interesting. It's pretty much, if you're gonna get one shot anyway, why not just have the higher damaging stuff? Now, if you do like to pair your characters alongside some tanking based stuff, like having more health and damage negation, then yeah, obviously don't equip this relic. Like having roughly around about 10% more status buildup and 10% more damage in just one singular relic, while only losing out on 7 vigor, I definitely think is worth it, because you can just counteract that downside with just a couple of vigor boosting relics anyway, and it could end up being worth it. Because a nice rule of thumb that I do have is that I try to have my relics be my damage boosting stuff, and I try to find damage negation stuff in the game. And the reason being is because the damage boosting stuff tends to be better on the relics, and the damage negation relics tend to be not that good and tend to be a lot better in game. Things like successive attacks negate damage and damage negation at full HP are much better than any damage negation relic that you can find. Now, the reason why you probably don't hear people talk about this much is because people don't really play the Executor as much, being that's the Ironeye kind of just outclasses him as a dexterity-based character. Now, if you already have an Ironeye on your team, then yeah, I recommend going with the Executor, because this guy can very much output the highest amount of damage, especially with this relic. Like, his DPS can be ridiculous and insane. But any single time that I'm playing in trios and I notice that we don't have an Ironeye, I'm gonna have to play Ironeye, because having the markability and his ultimate is just way too valuable for the team. Anyway, that is us now done with that one. As always, if you have your own opinions, let me know down in the comments. I will be making some more videos based on like the stat boosting relics. I probably end up talking about the intelligence and faith based ones next. So if that does interest you, definitely do like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next. See yous.